My name's Melissa, and I am a researcher from the University of Liverpool. Yesterday, we were incredibly lucky to get to start our Autism Talk series at the Victoria Gallery and Museum at the University of Liverpool campus. And we were especially lucky that the VGM agreed to run these events for free. And it was also an honour to get to present there. However, one thing that I did discover yesterday with my talk, which started off the series, is that there were acoustic accessibility difficulties for the audience, just because it was quite echoey, so a lot of people couldn't actually hear what was being said. So what I did during the talk was recorded it using stream capture in the hope that that would alleviate some of the difficulties afterwards if people were willing to go back and listen. However, when I played this back after the talk, I realised that the same acoustic difficulties were still there. So the microphone was quite crackly, it was still quite echoey, it was really hard to hear what was going on. So what I've decided is to re-record this talk, as quite a few people did ask for this to be available afterwards, whether they were at the talk or not. So I'm starting from scratch, but with the same content from yesterday. The only thing that's different is that I've taken out the research findings just because we are writing that up currently. So there might be a bit of a different dynamic just because this is probably a bit more personal than what a lecture would feel like, but hopefully it still has the same impact. So what I want to start off with is to introduce our general talk series, because although yesterday's talk won't be repeated, there are still 4 more talks which will be absolutely incredible. All are by autistic students, past or present, at the University of Liverpool, all of who have really insightful talks planned. So please, if you can make it, consider coming to at least one of the talks that we have planned. So starting next week is Sophie's talk, which is called Hidden in Plain Sight, where Sophie is going to talk about pre and post diagnostic self understanding. Followed by Celine the week afterwards, called My Experiences as an Autistic Woman, and Celine will explore this as a newly diagnosed female in comparison to other autistic women's experiences that are written up in non-fiction books. Ken will then start off the talk series again on the 29th of May, called Autism Music and Interacting with Our World Around Us. And Ken will look at coping mechanisms and sensory processing, as well as music as a special interest. And finally, Caroline Hands will finish up the series on June 5th with her talk, But You Don't Look Autistic and Other Stupid Statements, which is around the myths that people hold and stereotypes with autism, and also her personal experiences being autistic throughout motherhood and also throughout academia. So this series was set up by myself and by my research intern Sophie Williams, whose talk is next week. And what we really wanted was to give more autistic people within the university student culture a voice to talk about their experiences of being autistic. So normally what I do is, outside of being a PhD student, I host a module called Autism Psychology through the Continuing Education Department, which is a really great thing to teach. I absolutely love teaching it. The students often receive it very well. The only problem is that it is very much based in theory and research, and often autism research and theory changes very rapidly. Sometimes what I teach one year isn't the same as what I'm teaching the next. So bearing in mind that it changes so rapidly, it can be really difficult for students to consider what autism is with these very narrow or sometimes really inaccurate definitions of autism. So what we wanted is for people to hear the experiences of autistic people and make up their own mind what they think autism is in a much more accessible and without any stereotypical views on that. So we hope that you can make multiple talks or listen to multiple talks online. I will tell the rest of the speakers about the accessibility issues with the acoustics of the room and advise them accordingly to speak to people at the VGM to see if we can get something sorted with that. And also, if they are comfortable, to consider recording their talks either during or afterwards, whatever's easiest for them. So hopefully some more will be available online, but I do still recommend that you go, as there are obviously chances at the end to then speak with the presenters and ask questions about their talk. So now going on to my topic, which is broadly speaking focused on autism and reading, but I will also cover some representation difficulties and also experiences with other types of media. So I've already introduced myself at the start. My name's Melissa. I am a PhD student at the University of Liverpool. And broadly speaking, my interests are in supporting autistic adults in ways where we don't fundamentally change who people are. So we don't force them into social behaviours. For example, we don't focus on people making eye contact or people suddenly using these social scripts that are important in some way to social culture. Instead, what we focus on is supporting people in the ways that matter to them rather than what matters to society. So, people that want to learn socially or even in other ways, so emotions, imagination, and things like that. And specifically, the way that I'm doing this at the minute through my PhD work is by looking at how people can use reading, so texts like fictional texts and non-fiction texts, to create social models of the world, to try and understand communication that isn't natural to them if that's what they want to do. And I'm really used to coming and speaking about my work at conferences or in one-on-one conversations, either academically or impersonally. And what that usually requires is for me to justify why this matters, which will often be by talking about different papers that I've found reading to be important socially, or papers on autism and reading specifically, the few that do exist. And although that does matter, it matters to show that there is a grounding for this, and that was part of developing the research. It wasn't what created the initial idea. What created the initial idea was a very personal experience for me. It was that I was already using reading for social modelling and also other medias, but in particular, reading was important for me. And what I wanted was to see if this could expand to help other people through a research project. And that is ultimately what started everything off and what we're looking at now. So today I won't be focusing on the research that we have. I will instead be focusing on my personal perspective and my personal experiences. And then hopefully when we do get to publish our research, if you've also seen the talk prior, then you will understand where this has came from a bit better. So my email is on the screen and it will also be on the very last slide in case you think of anything more towards the end. So do feel free to get in touch with me, whether you have any comments, whether you have any questions, that's completely fine. So one thing that was important for us when we developed the talk series was that we didn't want to bog people down with definitions and theory and research, because it can be quite heavy to consider, especially when there's such conflicting ideas and findings. But what I did want to do was just introduce people to some of the terminology that gets used when we talk about autism. So you might hear this throughout the other talks, but you will definitely hear these terms during my talk. And I also just wanted to get you to think about autism in a bit of a different way to start with. So for me, I feel that the best way to explain autism is that it's a difference in cognition. So although some of you listening to this might be autistic, I imagine that some of you will also be neurotypical. So what I want you to do if you are neurotypical is think about your cognition. So think about your personal beliefs, your decisions that you make every single day, things that matter to you, your likes and interests, your hobbies. This is all down to the way you think about the world or you process the world, how you interact with that. Now try and consider if somebody was posing to you the idea to remove that cognition, to change how you thought about the world and your processes. And then think about how much different you would be as a person, how it would almost be impossible to separate how you think about things from who you are in terms of your personality. And that's the difficulty we face when we look at autism, is that often people do try and see it as a way of changing how we process the world or changing how we think about things. And that's really problematic when autism as a cognition is who we are as people. It is our personality, it is what we like and what we don't like. And it is also things like the decisions we make and choices that are important to us. So hopefully you will start to see autism as an equal, something to be valued just as much as neurotypical cognition. Now, that's not to say that autism doesn't come with disability, but often disability directly linked to autism is due to circumstance, so things being quite inaccessible for us. So, for example, if I go shopping and the shop has really bright lights, really loud music, that can be almost impossible, and in fact, sometimes I will turn around and walk back out and not be able to continue shopping for the things that I need. Now, that's not because autism inherently makes me disabled, it's because that one environment is so inaccessible to my thought processes and my cognition. So, when we change that, perceived disability becomes reduced. So, it's not that it's something inherent, it is how things are designed around us and how we interact with that matters a lot. Now, of course, some of us who are autistic do have disabilities inherently, whether that be a health condition, a mixture of cognitive conditions. So, for example, I'm also asthmatic, so that does make me disabled regardless of what's going on around me. But with autism, it's more complex than that because it is heavily about accessibility. And although there are distinct difficulties around that, there are also positives to being autistic, and that's what makes it equal to neurotypical, is that for the weaknesses that exist, there are equal strengths as well. So being autistic is generally a large part of who we are. In fact, it is who we are. It's not something that we can separate. And when we start to think about autism this way and get other people to think about autism this way, things become much more accessible and better understood, really. So, one thing that I wanted you to think about as another pathway of this is the language of disorder. So, you've likely heard autism referred to as the autistic spectrum. And when many people are diagnosed or when people discuss autism, especially in clinical settings, you might hear the term autistic spectrum disorder. Now, it doesn't mean that people using that term are negative or that they've got a really bad view of autism, because that's not how it is at all. It's just that this creates negative connotations instantly. So, on a general scale, on a societal scale, it would be ideal if we could change this type of language. So, if I said to somebody, I have an autistic spectrum disorder, instantly that makes it sound like I have something inherently bad, something that that person probably wouldn't want for themselves or for their family, something that they would perhaps worry that is affecting me in a really bad way. Whereas if I just tell people that I am autistic, then that creates more of an open dialogue around what that means for me and what that actually means in terms of cognition. So this is really important for trying to change how people view autism. But as well, it's important because of the negative impact that it has had in the past and also somewhat in the present. So, a lot of research and interventions focus around changing autistic individuals to be in line with neurotypical behaviour. And also, there is some focus on whether or not we should try and reduce the amount of cases of autism in the world, which is absolutely horrendous when you consider that autism is just a difference, it's a different cognition. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean that these people are just very negative towards autism. It could just be that the language of disorder has made it so inaccessible for them to understand what it means to be autistic. But the impacts for autistic people are humongous. So when we follow this negative narrative, what happens is you get self-identity difficulties, you get stigma, which can be both internal, so self-stigmatizing, and also external, so things like going for jobs. If that person has a negative view of autism, that makes it really inaccessible to have a chance at getting that job. It also means that support systems can become unhelpful. So, when you've been diagnosed, what you want is you want a supportive network who are going to encourage you to be the best version of yourself and help you to understand yourself and to navigate the world. But what happens when we look at autism in a negative light is that people are more likely to try and encourage us to change or to see ourselves as a negative, as a social disability. And this is really harmful for our self images and for the development of self understanding that comes after diagnosis, which Sophie will talk a little bit about next week. So, in terms of my personal experience, I just wanted to talk about my diagnostic pathway because hopefully all four speakers after myself will cover this in some light too. So, then you might be able to start seeing the differences that exist in diagnosis, but also some of the overlapping experiences that we have. So, for me, I was diagnosed when I was 18, which, if you did book onto the talk, you would have seen online when you booked your tickets. But the important thing for me was that this felt incredibly late. I'd gone through my whole childhood and teenage years not knowing who I was. I had a lot of self identity difficulties around that. I didn't really understand what was right and wrong. I felt like everything that I did, especially socially, was wrong. And so that starts to create difficulties with mental health, and that did happen for me. It also meant that I was more likely to isolate myself socially just to avoid feeling socially disabled. So there were a lot of negatives around that, but what shocked me more was when I did become an autism researcher, and also when I started to meet more autistic people and found that actually 18 is really quite young compared to a lot of people out there. So some people are diagnosed as late as between the ages of 60 and 80, so really late adulthood. Other people, it's in their 20s, their 30s. It can be incredibly later than teenage years, which really, really shocked me because knowing how difficult that experience was for me, can't even begin to imagine how that must be with all of those years gone by without that knowledge. Now, I do want to highlight that some people do self diagnose, and that's completely fine. And that is a way of sort of helping along that process of self understanding before the official diagnosis comes, which hopefully it would. However, for myself, I didn't understand autism enough to think that I was autistic. I didn't ever consider that, and for many people, that's also true. So, diagnosis is a real importance. And many people ask, why would you want to be labelled autistic? And it's not that we want this special category, it's that when you're different, it's so important to understand that there's a reason and that there is a group that you fit in with, and that there's a whole culture around that that makes it so much easier to understand yourself and navigate the world. But once I was diagnosed, it wasn't that all of these problems went away. Diagnosis was definitely the right path for me because things did open up and self understanding did get better. However, it was that it almost just turned into different difficulties. So there was stigma around diagnosis for me, and that's just because people think that there's a look to autism. They have this stereotype view of what an autistic person should look like. And for me, that wasn't in keeping with the typical vision of autism. So I had a lot of people tell me that both psychiatrists involved in my diagnosis must have somehow been wrong, that something must have gotten lost in translation, bearing in mind that to get diagnosed, I see my psychiatrist at least 5 times, and each and every time she was still confident that I was autistic. So when people are challenging you and challenging that diagnosis, that causes even more difficulties because you then start to feel, well, I don't fit in with ordinary neurotypical groups, but now people are telling me that I don't even fit in with these autistic groups where I felt like I belonged so much. So that in itself can create a lot of difficulties and barriers, especially when you have a cognition where change is difficult and where you're having to completely uproot your self-identity and reaffirm that. So what can then happen is that we can start to have difficulties of whether or not we should disclose our diagnosis. And this is really important in the workplace because when we don't disclose our diagnosis for fear of stigma of some sort, or because we don't feel like it's the right thing to do, then that makes things really inaccessible. Because if employers in this example don't understand that we're autistic, then we can't ask for things to be accessible and we can't make things better for ourselves. So it is that there are still difficulties after diagnosis, it's just that they change, and that was especially the case for myself. And this is particularly important for this talk because what reading and social modelling meant for me changed very much before and after diagnosis. So I'm going to start by talking about fictional texts, just because fictional texts are very social. It's really easy to see the parallels as for how that can help in developing social models. So before diagnosis for me, like I said, things were quite different in how I used fiction. And in fact, I didn't use it half as much as I did after diagnosis because I was quite stereotypical as what people would expect, in that I just sat with non-fiction books and wanted to collect different facts about different things. But when I did read fiction, when that was accessible and it was there, it was an incredibly powerful teaching experience for me. It taught me many social things, it taught me about myself. And relatability was completely crucial to that. So I did grow up during the Harry Potter era, and although I absolutely love Harry Potter now, and I did love the films and the merchandise back then, I couldn't really get on board with the books. It wasn't something I had much interest in reading. And that was just because for me, it didn't make sense to have a book where a child was struggling and everything turned out completely fantastic, and he instantly found this place where he belonged and where everything went really well. Although I was really happy and I did understand the importance of having that, for me I wanted something much more real, so I turned to A Series of Unfortunate Events, which some of you might know. And it's a series about three orphans who are siblings, and they're also quite different from other kids their age, but they find identity within each other, within their group, and they learn to navigate these really harsh situations where people are trying to exploit them in various different ways. So that in itself was powerful for me because it taught me to be a bit less naive and be cautious of my surroundings, but also to seek out similar others, people with similar cognition to me, even when I didn't quite understand who I was. That was incredibly powerful. So also fiction became a place of belonging. So when I did really get into fiction, and back then it tended to be a full series, I needed something that I could really get immersed in, and preferably something that had cross media examples, so where there was film or TV linked. But going into that book, into that world, and feeling as though I belonged somewhere else was so powerful because I no longer felt socially disabled. I no longer felt that I didn't belong. Instead, I had all these characters around me that felt just like people. It didn't feel like being alone, and it felt that I was learning and also belonging at the same time, so it was really, really powerful. However, there were barriers, so particularly when I was younger and before diagnosis, I had difficulties with imagination. I couldn't visualise characters, especially sometimes places, and that made it so difficult to get immersed in a book and to feel like I was in this new place. And that hindered then how much that I could actually use fiction for social modelling and for learning other things. So, looking at how that changed post diagnosis, I still had barriers, I still had the same barriers, and in fact, as I was getting older, it was getting harder because there was less media that was linked in with books that were available or popular within my age group. Of course, some still do exist, but it tended to be more younger adult stuff, so the older I was getting, the harder it was for me to find something relatable. And what became much more important to me was actually relating to people. And that's just because although I did have some great people around me when I was younger before diagnosis, I understood them really well. I've been around them constantly. And as I was getting older, social aspects became much more important to me. I was no longer happy with just staying on my own outside of family experiences and getting invested in a book or a film, for example. Instead, I did want to go out and have people that mattered to me. I wasn't interested in mass socialisation, but I did want select people that I felt I could relate to, and there were more and more people coming into my life, both neurotypicals and autistic people, that I really wanted to understand, that really mattered to me. So I knew that I had to do something to try and learn how to communicate with them better and also to understand where they were coming from. So again, I didn't want to change who I was, I didn't want to change how I communicated, I just wanted to learn how to break down some of the barriers and help other people understand my methods of communication, but also help myself to understand their methods. So this became a great social learning tool for me once I got past these barriers, and the way that I'd done that was by having real examples. So I would try and pair characters up with people in my real life, or actors or characters from games, for example, and I would visualise them. And that really helped me, in fact, because then I started to see parallels between characters and often real people in my real life, or other times other characters. So I started to develop a really strong sense of self and also of other people, and differences and similarities between people and how that changed how they interacted. So this was a really powerful tool for me, and I just want to show you an example of how that has been useful in recent years. So there is a book that came out, I think it was about a year ago now, and it's by the author Gail Honeyman. The book is called Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine. And in this book, it follows the lead character Eleanor, who doesn't actually have a diagnosis of autism. Instead, it's heavily hinted that she has experiences of psychosis. But Eleanor is highly relatable for me and also for some other autistic people I've spoken to, and that is just because her cognition is very similar. She does struggle with understanding people and understanding communication barriers because she struggles heavily with perspective taking. So, just to start off this extract, it follows Eleanor as during her experience with her colleague Raymond, and so it starts unprompted. Raymond started to tell me about his mother, how he was going to visit her tomorrow, something he did every Sunday. She was a widow and not terribly well. She had a lot of cats, and he helped her care for them. On and on and on he droned. I interrupted him. So reading this for me was quite powerful because it was the first time I followed a cognition in a book that was so identical to my own. So in this example, Eleanor is getting a lot of social information from Raymond, social information she doesn't really understand the importance of. And for me, I can almost see that she's fact collecting, which is what I do, and I can completely relate to that. She has all this information about Raymond's mother in her life, but she just doesn't know what to do with it. And I could instantly see that Eleanor was struggling with that because that's what I struggle with. So the extract goes on to say, Raymond, I said, can I ask you something? He sipped his pint. Sure. If I were to purchase a smartphone, which type would you advise? I have been looking into the relative merits of iPhones compared with Android devices, and I'd appreciate an insider's perspective on the cost-benefit ratio, as it were. He looked somewhat surprised at my question, which was odd, given that he worked in IT and therefore must be asked technological questions quite frequently. So this goes on to explain that Raymond is really uncomfortable talking about work. He ends up leaving the situation completely. And this was the first time that I really understood that people don't quite like this type of interaction. Because this was my go-to, the same as it was for Eleanor, was to focus on the person's knowledge and knowledge exchange at the expense of talking about social constructs. And for me, that was much more powerful. But this was the first time that I saw that often people do want to talk socially and that they don't always want to talk about their knowledge, that sometimes they want to escape what they know and that sometimes it's not appropriate with the context. So this was powerful to help me understanding how other people might see me. But also it was the first time that I saw how other people can really be problematic. So while Eleanor could have expressed her misunderstandings with Raymond, he also could have done the same. He could have explained to Eleanor why he didn't really want to talk technology and why he did want to talk about his mother and his social life. So this really helped to shape my project, in addition with hearing talks from Damien Milton, who focuses on the double empathy paradigm. I then decided that for my research I wanted to teach neurotypical people about autistic culture and how autistic people prefer to socialise, in as much as teaching autistic people the same with neurotypicals. So this was very, very powerful for me. And like I said, it did help reading this book to be able to follow that cognition that was very similar. But I did feel that other than learning how people might perceive me and how they might not communicate in the best way they could, I didn't particularly learn much because it didn't take me out of my comfort zone. So what I did do after I read this was I read Huxley's Brave New World, which many of you might have heard of. It's classic literature and it's dystopian. So in Huxley's world, people are created rather than born, and they are conditioned into a social category. And the main character, Bernard, he has been assigned into one of the top social categories, but his conditioning hasn't actually worked. So he doesn't believe in conformity, he doesn't quite fit in with anybody in his category, and everybody's really wary of him, and some people actually ostracised him in the book because of that. So I started to really relate to this character and could see parallels to myself being autistic and compared to being in a largely neurotypical situation. It felt like that was very similar to what Bernard was going through. But then about midway through the book, Bernard finds himself in a situation where he becomes very socially popular. And he then gets the opportunity to start to behave like the other people, to start becoming very superior in his ways and neglect other people that are socially different in that world. And Bernard actually takes that experience, and that made me vastly uncomfortable being in a role of a character throughout who I related to so closely, then put into a situation where he behaved in a way that I couldn't even consider myself behaving in. And although at the time I really didn't appreciate it, and that made me feel very uncomfortable and not quite happy reading the book when I picked it up, it did teach me a lot about myself, about what I was happy with and what I wasn't happy with, and how I would behave in those situations. And having that simulation was really important to me because, again, coming back to the understanding of other people, it meant that I was able to understand what kinds of people I preferred and what kinds of people I didn't quite understand and how they might behave completely different to me. So, books are a really powerful tool for me now, especially in social modelling. But it's not to say that this is exclusive to fiction, and often that's the narrative that is given, is that fiction is very important socially and that non-fiction isn't of much use. But I find that this is completely untrue, and especially being autistic, I think that non-fiction has a massive importance. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about special interests. So when I say special interests, I'm not referring to the myth of a special talent that people believe autistic individuals have. So I have seen examples of autistic people, especially online, who have incredible talents. I saw a video recently on an autistic man who can speak backwards, which is absolutely insanely talented. But it's not that we all get this special talent along with the diagnosis. Most of us are just ordinary people with different skills, like neurotypicals have. But when we talk about special interests, we're not talking about this. We're actually talking about one of the main positives of being autistic, which is the ability to hyper focus on a topic that we are very, very interested in. And this tends to involve collection behaviours. So that could be merchandise, it could be collecting records, for example, or it could be fact collecting, which more often than not does include. So for me, I prefer my special interests to be of cross media transcendence. So I prefer something where I can listen to music and then I can go and watch something afterwards and maybe read something. So my special interest outside of academia is Pink Floyd. And originally I really wanted to do a talk for this series on special interests, but there was a real danger that I would just show up for an hour and talk about Pink Floyd. That maybe some people would be interested, but most would be bored, senseless. So this is how intense these interests are, this is how much they mean to us, and they are so important to our identity when they do exist. So, particularly to give an example of how this works, when two autistic people talk about their interest, it's an incredible experience when you are one of those autistic people, but other neurotypical people watching in on this situation have often spoke about how strange this seems. Because when you see two autistic people discussing different interests, we call it information dumping. And this is the best way to explain it because it's probably what it looks like to an outsider. So if I was talking to a friend who had a different interest, I would share a fact about Pink Floyd and then they would share a fact about their interest and then I would share another about mine and vice versa. And I think to an outsider, the difficulty is that it looks like we're not listening to each other, we're not responding really directly to what that person's told us, but we are taking it in, and that is why it's such an amazing experience of communication. Because in fact, we're just fact swapping and we're collecting information that we are so interested in, but because it doesn't seem like we're communicating, that can be really difficult for people to grasp. And it can be a difficulty when we look at interaction between autistic individuals and neurotypical individuals, because often neurotypical individuals struggle to talk about one topic as intensely as autistic people can. And so that can pose difficulties, and sometimes autistic individuals don't want to talk to people who don't feel passionate about their interest. So it's something that we can potentially use for social modelling and helping autistic people and neurotypical people to communicate, but hopefully in a way that is accessible to both, so where interests do still matter. And non-fiction can really help this because it provides information, but also where it isn't possible to have these conversations, it provides an important social element of having alone time with an interest. So when I teach about autism psychology, one thing I do teach is that autism comes with a need for alone time more often than not. So it doesn't mean that we want to be isolated, it doesn't mean that we don't enjoy socialising, it just means that during that social experience, we need to plan alone time to go and process what's happened, to process the social experience and how we felt. And one really powerful way of doing that is to have time with a special interest that can really help to process social elements of what we've just experienced, but also to engage with our cognition a bit more. So it is really powerful in this way. But that's not to say that non-fiction doesn't have its social uses in the same way that fiction does. So in fact, if somebody came up to me and said that they wanted to learn about autism, particularly if they were neurotypical and had no other way of learning about autism and autistic people, I would direct them to non-fiction, and that's just because that's where you have more real autistic voices. So there are autistic authors that do write about fictional autistic characters, which obviously is really helpful, but unfortunately representation within fiction is quite limited. There aren't many autistic characters, and when they do exist, they're not often great representations. They do sometimes fall into that stereotype view of autism. Whereas with non-fiction, when you've got real autistic people talking about their experiences and what it means for them to be autistic, that is incredibly educational for neurotypical individuals especially, but also for autistic people who are recently diagnosed or are navigating a difficult situation where they want to understand how that's been for other autistic people. That is an incredible comfort. And again, it comes back to having this group of your own and feeling like you're not completely alone in your experiences. So also for me as a psychology student, I found that just generally social science texts were massively helpful, being able to pick up a book and learn about why people react the way they do. So group behaviour, aggression, crowd behaviours, that was incredible for me. It was accessible in understanding what circumstances and contexts are important and how people might react differently in those circumstances. So non-fiction can be used again for social modelling, but also it can help with social change movements because generally it is able to talk about more sensitive topics. And at this point in the talk, I do want to, again, as I did yesterday, just talk about something a little bit different for a moment. So many of you might have heard about applied behavioural analysis, which refers to itself as a therapy, also known as ABA. And I just wanted to give an example of how non-fiction can be incredibly powerful at expressing the harmfulness of ABA. And I do advise that if you've been affected by ABA, or if this could be distressing to you, that you just skip on to the next slide in this talk. I won't talk about it in the next slide to make sure that that accessibility is there. But for those that are interested, there's a really powerful poem, and I just wanted to read you part of that. So this poem is based on the real life experience of an autistic individual called Julia Bascom. And she wrote this poem for the book Loud Hands, which is an anthology of text from autistic people about their life experiences, and it does heavily cover different elements of discrimination. And it's written by the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. They've published the texts that are written by multiple autistic adults. So the poem by Julia is called Quiet Hands. So to start this poem, Julia says, "When I was a little girl, they held my hands down in tacky glue while I cried. I'm a lot bigger than them now. Walking down a hall to a meeting, my hand flies out to feel the texture on the wall as I pass by. Quiet hands, I whisper. My hand falls to my side. When I was 6 years old, people were much bigger than me, with loud echoing voices held my hands down in textures that hurt worse than my broken wrist. While I cried and begged and pleaded and screamed. In a classroom of language impaired kids, the most common phrase is a metaphor, quiet hands. A student pushes a piece of paper, flaps their hands, stacks their fingers against their palm, pokes at a pencil, rubs their palms through their hair. It's silence until quiet hands. I'm yet to meet a student who didn't instinctively know to pull back and put their hands in their lap at this order. Thanks to applied behavioural analysis, each student learned this phrase in preschool at the latest. hands slapped down and held to a table or at their sides for a count of 3 until they learnt to restrain themselves at the words. The literal meaning of the words is irrelevant when you're being abused. When I was a little girl, I was autistic, and when you're autistic, it's not abuse, it's therapy. So I found this an incredibly powerful, yet upsetting poem that shows an incredibly important message about how interventions aiming to change autism can be incredibly harmful for autistic people that are exposed to that. So, what I do often find as an autistic researcher is that I end up debating ABA to many people, in particular neurotypical individuals, because obviously it is important for autistic people to learn, just as it is for neurotypical people to learn. And that includes learning safety behaviours and context appropriateness. However, that is not the basis of ABA. ABA instead takes autistic people and tries to turn them into neurotypical behaviour, tries to force them to behave as neurotypical people do, which is incredibly harmful and is not the same as teaching somebody about safety and about context. So, the best example of explaining the harmfulness of ABA is stimming behaviours, and that's ultimately what Quiet Hands is about. So when we talk about stimming behaviours, most autistic people have these, and it can include hand flapping, it can include pacing up and down, sometimes more fine movement and dexterity. So you would have heard of fidget spinners and sensory toys. That is also a form of stimming for us. And people looking in often mistake this and think that stimming is a negative behaviour when we're not happy or when things are out of control. Instead, it's best to view stimming as a form of autistic expression. So, of course, stimming does happen when we're in distress, when things aren't going well, but it's also a form of positive expression as well. So, as much as I would have stimming behaviours when I'm struggling, I would also have it during incredibly intense and positive experiences. So, it's important for us to express ourselves. It's not something negative, and just because it can occur in negative experiences doesn't mean that it is ingrained in that negativity. And unfortunately, ABA often tries to get rid of stimming behaviours, and that is just one example of how ABA can be really harmful. But this is also an example of how non-fiction can really address and help to move forward these debates on really intense and difficult topics. So now that I've spoken about reading and social modelling, I just wanted to talk a little about general media, because for me I found that it wasn't just reading that helped, there were many other medias that helped me to understand myself and other people a bit better. Now for me in particular, I found that reading was the best example of social modelling and self-support, because I was able to get more perspective with the character. There's lots of inner monologue on the page, there's lots of contextual information and description, and for me that was just much more accessible. So one thing with TV and film is that there is an incredible difficulty with autism representation. So you might have heard of the comparisons between the film Rain Man and autism, which are incredibly incorrect. And many people have came forward to say that Rain Man is not even trying to depict autism. It is trying to depict what we call savant syndrome, which is something sometimes related but also very different. And it's also not very accurate to autistic experiences in any way. It's very stereotyped, and the problem is that it has set autistic understanding back when people focus on these kinds of representation, because they then expect that type of behaviour from everybody. And when you don't then meet that picture, it's incredibly hard to try and get people to understand you in the same way. However, I did personally find that TV examples and representations, even when not entirely accurate, could be helpful. So when I was diagnosed, The Big Bang Theory was really helpful. And although the characters aren't officially labelled as autistic, many people in the autistic community did identify with those characters. So to begin with, they had the character Sheldon, and then they introduced a female character, Amy, who had similar traits. And for me, it was much easier to explain to people when they would ask me what it meant to be autistic, it was easier to say, well, do you know Big Bang Theory? And if not, just go and YouTube those characters. And they would instantly then see parallels to my experiences. And because they weren't labelled autistic, the benefit was that people then didn't stereotype, they didn't assume that we were all that way. But it was an accessible method of getting people to instantly understand autism. So media can be really powerful, but it does require intense caution around accurate representation and tasteful representation. And one thing that I feel does this really well is the TV show Atypical, which is on Netflix. And it follows an autistic boy called Sam. And it also captures the family experience in a way that doesn't make Sam peripheral. And they also do have actually autistic actors in the show, although they are more peripheral characters. They are important in Sam's social life, which is really great to see. And also, there are some females as well as males who are autistic. And I do believe that they included some different cultures as well. So there's lots of minority representation, which you don't often see in media, which is really powerful. However, media for autistic people, from my own perspective, I think can sometimes be a bit of a social barrier. So often, us autistic people will mimic as we're growing, as we're understanding social situations. We will see a behaviour, we will see a situation, and we will just copy what we've seen, especially if it seems that that has elicited a very positive response. Now, media can be a little bit harmful in this way when we look at TV and film, because especially in, for example, soap operas, everything is a little bit exaggerated, so people argue in ways that they don't tend to in ordinary life. Situations are more fast paced and more exaggerated because maybe they wouldn't be as entertaining without that value. But it is then difficult for autistic people looking to this media for social modelling, and this is why I much personally prefer reading, because I just felt that it was a more realistic way of social modelling and understanding behaviours than TV and film was. But again, that's not to say that this wasn't important. For myself and for other autistic people that I know, characters in TV and film were really important in developing a social identity, things that we liked and things that we didn't like, and ways that we wanted to aspire to be. So it does have its place. And also, one thing I found was incredibly important to my social development was becoming a gamer. And for me, the most powerful example of this were role playing games. So when I say role playing games, I don't necessarily just mean games like The Witcher or like Dragon Age, where you're completely in control of that character and where there's lots of dialogue options. I even mean games where you're just taking on a completely different role and having to navigate that character's cognition. So recently, for example, I played the game Detroit Become Human, which is about robots who have become sentient in a world of humans who have up until now been using them for tasks in life and to make things easier. And the robots face an intense difficulty in trying to get the humans to see their perspective and to view them as equals rather than as less. And the humans are, as a group, trying to shut them down, trying to get rid of them because they feel threatened. And throughout the game, you get many choices, and you get choices in how you want to behave to resolve this group dynamic. And what I found really helpful was seeing what things helped to reduce that group conflict, what things helped the humans in the game to view them more as an equal, as an ally. Because for me, this had strong parallels to the difficulties between autistic people and neurotypicals, although it was much more extreme than what it feels like to be an autistic person. It did start to show these social dynamics, and it was incredibly relatable in that way. But also games where they are vastly different, where you're taking on a completely different role. So sometimes in a world that would never exist, sometimes in a world that no longer exists, or a job that I would never do. It is incredible to get that accessibility, that experience, to see what it would be like and what things help in communication and what things don't help so much. So what I do particularly like is having that dialogue option and being able to see, well, if I answer this way to this character, what way are they going to react? Are they going to like me more? Are they going to dislike me? How are people going to interpret that? And one thing I've really found is that often my intention in choosing that dialogue option is completely different from how the character takes it. So that's helpful for me to see these barriers in communication. And that is incredibly powerful. So it just goes to show that it's not just reading that's important, but also other forms of media like gaming and like TV. But like I said, autism representation isn't always the best in any form of media. And what is great to see in the gaming community is that more characters are being labelled autistic, even if they just have a minor role in the game. So, focusing more broadly on representation and what difficulties can present, the main difficulty is that when it does exist, which is not often enough, there tends to be a lot of stereotyping that happens with autistic characters. So they have behaviours that are more textbook, old-fashioned, what people thought about autistic people, rather than the accurate uniqueness of the autistic experience and being an autistic adult. And also, like I said before, the difficulty is that often autism is peripheral, and sometimes there isn't even focus on the autistic person as being important. Instead, it's seen as just autism is this thing in the room that is affecting everybody else, and that the character doesn't even really matter so much. And that can be really harmful because, again, it can start to feed into this negative narrative and language of disorder. So, as I highlighted before, there are shows like Atypical that try and include more minority groups, but it is important to consider that autism isn't the same experience for all autistic people. We are all very unique because we have our own personalities, our own life experiences, but also if you're in a different minority group as well as being autistic, that makes things even harder. So even just comparing what we consider to be autistic male and autistic female, there are so many differences that are being challenged currently in the area. And we don't even know about people that don't identify with those categories. So it's massively important to understand what it's like for minority groups who are also autistic, so different cultures, different genders, things like that. And unfortunately, there just isn't enough depiction of that in the media, which hopefully will start to change as time goes on. There are also issues around directors and people linked to shows or games or other types of media not explicitly labelling characters as autistic, not being comfortable enough to do that. And while I can completely understand that, especially if the person isn't autistic or doesn't have much of an experience with autistic people, they might not want to cause offence, they might not want to feed into stereotype views. So that might actually be a really great decision to make, not to explicitly label it, but to leave it open to interpretation. However, it can be harmful for when the autistic community finds these incredible characters that they find are great representations of the community, but unfortunately haven't been labelled. Because what that then means is that neurotypicals watching the show won't automatically make the parallel. Whereas if it was labelled this character's autistic, they might then start to see autism in a different way. So it's all about accessibility and trying to consider how we can make it better and how neurotypicals especially can understand autistic people a bit better through media. So just to finish up, again, here is my contact information. Of course, during the talk, I did allow for questions at this point, which is not doable in the sense of a recorded talk. So do feel free to send me a message on Twitter or via email, whether again that be a comment or a question. I'm completely fine with that, and I do hope that this has been both enjoyable and more accessible than the previous recording, and that also it does translate well outside of a lecture setting.